I always thought of the lake cabin as a piece of living memory, not just a structure made of cedar planks and faded shingles, but a place that held the echoes of every laugh, every argument, every late night marshmallow roasting session my family had ever shared. My grandfather built it in the early 70s with his own hands, back when the lake was nothing more than a sleepy patch of blue, surrounded by forest and dirt roads. He used to tell us how he would hammer nails into place while loons called across the water, how he salvaged windows from a demolished farmhouse miles away just to give the cabin soul. By the time I was born, the cabin wasn't just a vacation spot. It was a generational anchor. Summers there weren't optional, they were sacred. We knew every knot in the wooden floors, every creak in the porch steps. But things changed when the Homeowners Association slithered into our idyllic slice of heaven. At first, the HOA's arrival seemed like a joke. The lake had maybe 30 cabins scattered around its shores, most of them built decades ago. People came here to escape the rules, not pile on more. But somewhere in the mid-2000s, a few new property owners decided the lake needed standards to preserve property values, they said. They formed the Lakeshore Preservation Association, LPA, but everyone called it the HOA anyway. And at the center of it all was Karen. You know the type. The name has practically become a cultural shorthand. But trust me, this Karen wasn't just a stereotype. She was the archetype. She was in her late 50s, but wore her blonde bob like it was armor, always lacquered with enough hairspray to survive a hurricane. She had that perpetual squint that made you feel judged even when she was just looking in your direction, and she spoke with the kind of confidence only found in people who have never considered the possibility they might be wrong. The first time I met Karen, she was standing at the edge of my dock, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose like she was surveying enemy territory. "Do you know," she said without introduction, "that technically docks can't extend more than 12 feet without board approval?" "My grandfather built this dock in 1974, I said, still holding the bait box I'd been carrying down to the water. "There was no board back then." "Well," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "there's one now." That was my introduction to Karen, a woman who treated the HOA charter like the Constitution and herself like the Supreme Court. Over the next few summers, the rules came like waves, each one a little higher than the last. First, it was no plastic lawn chairs, they're unsightly. Then, no exterior paint colors that aren't on the approved palette. The kicker for me was the decorative item regulation, no more than 2 per yard. She sent me an actual violation notice for having a birdhouse, a wind chime, and a little frog statue on the porch rail. I laughed at first, then I didn't. The thing about Karen was that she had the time, the energy, and the gall to enforce every ridiculous rule. And she didn't just enforce them, she enforced them selectively. Her good friends on the HOA board magically never seemed to get dinged for their rule breaking. But me? Every summer I'd find some smugly worded letter waiting on the cabin steps, always signed with regards, Karen Phillips, HOA president. I tried to brush it off, tried to tell myself that the cabin was worth the nonsense. But the tension built, like storm clouds over the water. And then came the summer, she crossed the line. It was a bright June morning when I arrived at the cabin with my truck packed full of groceries, tools, and all the little comforts you haul up when you plan to stay for weeks. But something felt off. There was a for sale sign, not on my property, but 2 lots down. Karen's white SUV was parked outside her own cabin, as usual, but there was another car I didn't recognize, a shiny black pickup with dealer tags still on it. I didn't think much of it at first. Then I noticed the sign staked in the ground near the community mailbox. It was new, printed with that self-important HOA logo, an outline of the lake with a pine tree on each side, and it said in bold letters, "Notice, property allocation updates, effective immediately." I frowned because the last allocation update involved garbage pickup schedules, and this looked far more official. I walked up to the sign. There was a packet of papers in a plastic sleeve stapled underneath. And there it was, in bureaucratic language that managed to be both vague and horrifying. Per board vote, certain lakefront properties under HOA jurisdiction are being reassigned for maintenance oversight and usage reassessment, effective June 1st. I read the list. I read it again. My cabin lot number was on it, next to the name Brian Phillips, Karen's son. I felt my throat go dry. I stormed up to Karen's cabin. She was on the porch, watering her hanging plants like nothing in the world was amiss. "What the hell is this?" I snapped, waving the packet. She looked at me with that same practice smile. "Oh good, you saw the notice. This will make things so much easier." "Easier?" My voice went sharp. "It says here my property has been reassigned to your son. What does that even mean?" Karen set her watering can down, like this was all perfectly reasonable. "Brian just bought a cabin 2 streets over," she said, "but he's been struggling with boat access. The board decided, after reviewing community needs, that it made sense for him to have access to your dock and shoreline. It's really just a paperwork thing. You'll still have most of your property." "Most?" She actually waved her hand, dismissing my outrage like I was complaining about a parking space. "It's about sharing resources, sweetie. Besides, the board voted unanimously. It's all in the minutes." I stared at her, trying to make sense of the audacity. She wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She was taking. The rest of that day was a blur of disbelief and frantic phone calls. I dug out every deed, every tax receipt, every scrap of paper proving ownership of the cabin and land. The HOA didn't own my property. They didn't even have authority over the structure itself. What they did control, thanks to some decades-old easements, were shared community resources. Things like the boat launch, the hiking trails, and, apparently, they were now claiming the shoreline counted. Brian showed up that evening. He was exactly what you'd expect. Mid-20s, gym muscles, a baseball cap turned backward. He looked at my dock like it was already his. "Hey," he said casually, "Mom said you'd probably have questions, but don't worry, I'll keep the place nice. I'm bringing my jet skis next week." Jet skis. The words hit me like a slap. This was no longer about Karen being an annoying HOA president with too much free time. This was about my family's legacy, the cabin my grandfather built, being chipped away by entitlement and greed until it became just another playground for Karen's brat. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch listening to the loons, staring out at the water, thinking of my grandfather's calloused hands hammering nails, of my dad teaching me how to bait a hook on that dock. And all I could see was Brian Phillips zooming across the lake on a jet ski, tearing through those memories like they meant nothing. By morning, my disbelief had hardened into something else. Resolve. Karen might have thought she ran the lake. She might have thought her clipboard and her little rules gave her the power to carve up people's property like slices of pie. But she made one mistake, one enormous mistake. She came after the wrong cabin. And I wasn't about to roll over and let her son play king of the dock. The morning after Karen dropped her little property reassignment bombshell, I woke up with that familiar feeling you get when you've been wronged so badly that your brain is already halfway through drafting arguments before your feet hit the floor. I wasn't just angry. I was in a state of disbelief so strong it made me question my own sanity. I grabbed my coffee, sat on the porch, and spread out every document I had. Old deeds, property surveys, tax assessments, HOA bylaws printed off on their smug little website. If there's one thing I know, it's that paperwork is power. And if Karen was going to play games, I was going to learn the rules better than she did. It didn't take long to see what she'd done. The HOA didn't, and couldn't, own my cabin or the land itself. That was locked tight with my deed. But buried in the bylaws was language about shared access rights along the lake's edge. Back when my grandfather signed some agreement in the 80s, it seemed harmless. It just allowed neighbors to fish off each other's shorelines or pull up a canoe in an emergency. But Karen, in all her diabolical creativity, twisted that language until it gave her board power over shoreline usage. In other words, she couldn't take my cabin, but she could screw with the one thing that made the cabin magical: the dock, the water access, the reason you have a lake cabin in the first place. I sat there staring at that clause until the words blurred. All I could think was, she planned this. She really planned this. And Karen didn't stop there. By noon, an email pinged in my inbox from the HOA mailing list, a smug little newsletter with updates. There, in bullet point glory, we're thrilled to welcome Brian Phillips to Shared Dock Space number 17. Shared Dock Space. My dock space. I could practically hear her cackle in the subtext. I tried reason first. That afternoon, I marched over to her cabin, clutching the deed like a talisman. She opened the door with that same Botox-tight smile. "Karen," I said, "we need to talk. Now." "Oh, of course, dear. Come in." The way she said dear made my blood pressure spike. I laid it all out: the ownership documents, the surveys, the fact that the dock had been built by my grandfather decades before her HOA ever existed. "You can't just give my shoreline to your son," I said, voice sharp but steady. Karen's response? A little tilt of her head and that maddening calm voice people use when they think you're overreacting. "It's not your shoreline," she said. "It's community-managed space. You should think of it as sharing. Sharing implies consent." I snapped. "I didn't consent." She tapped her clipboard. The board voted unanimously. I realized then how pointless reason was. Karen wasn't going to back down because Karen never backs down. That's the thing about people like her. They thrive on escalation. They want you to fight them because every argument validates their self-image as the one in charge. I left before I said something that would have landed me on the HOA's verbal misconduct list. Yes, that's a thing. They actually keep one. But that didn't mean I was done. Next, I went to the neighbors. I knocked on doors, trying to rally some support. Most people were sympathetic, but in that awkward, "Oh gosh, that's awful, but we don't want to get involved" way. I heard the same refrain over and over. "You know how Karen is." Yeah, I did. Too well. By the end of the day, my outrage had boiled over into something sharper, something colder. That night, sitting on the porch with a beer in hand, staring out at the dock, I decided, if Karen wanted a war, I'd give her one. But not a shouting match. Not a legal letter duel. No, I wanted something better. Something she'd never see coming. The turning point came the next day at the HOA meeting. HOA meetings are always held at their head office, a pompous name for what is essentially a converted bait shop they rent for $200 a month. Karen presided over the meeting from behind a folding table like she was the governor of the lake, gavel and all. I sat in the back, arms crossed, listening as they droned through the agenda. Dock allocations, shoreline cleanup, some ridiculous no-tiki torches proposal. Then came the moment. Item 7, Karen announced, finalizing reassignment of shoreline usage rights for properties 15 through 20. Congratulations to Brian Phillips for being granted dock space number 17. My dock. She looked up from her papers and smiled, that little victory smile. "Any objections?" she asked, like she hadn't already made up her mind. I stood up. "Yes," I said. "I object." The room went quiet. Karen arched an eyebrow. "Objection noted," she said sweetly. "But the board has already voted." It was like arguing with a wall. The meeting ended in a blur of fake politeness and tight smiles. But I wasn't discouraged. If anything, the smug way she dismissed me only fueled what was forming in my head. A plan so outrageous it would flip the power dynamic entirely. The seed of the idea came from an offhand comment Brian had made when he came to gloat the other day. He'd mentioned bringing his jet skis and a couple buddies to use the dock. I'd picture them roaring up, tying off their toys, acting like my cabin was just an accessory to their summer fun. And then I'd pictured what would happen if, well, they couldn't get to the dock at all. That night, I sketched out the first version of the fence. Not just any fence, the fence. It wasn't going to be a flimsy little picket border. No, I envisioned something taller, bolder, more obnoxious. A fence that screamed, mine. A fence that would make Karen's eye twitch every time she saw it. But here's the kicker. I wasn't going to stop at the cabin. Oh no, if Karen wanted to play bureaucracy with me, I was going to play it back, with petty precision. The HOA's head office? That little converted bait shop? It sat on land owned by the HOA, but bordered by a thin strip of my family's property. A strip nobody ever paid attention to. A strip Karen had probably forgotten even existed. Guess where I decided to run the fence? Exactly. But first, I needed ammunition. I called my cousin, who's a contractor, and floated the idea under the guise of property security. He didn't ask many questions, just told me what kind of fencing would send a message and what permits I'd need. Then I spent an entire afternoon at the county clerk's office, poring through old plats and surveys. The clerk, a sweet woman who looked like she'd been working there since the Nixon administration, helped me dig out the original boundary maps. And there it was, a sliver of land, no more than 6 feet wide, running right up to the corner of the HOA office. Technically mine. Karen had been so busy playing Queen of the Lake, she never noticed the pawn sneaking across the board. The next weekend, I made my move. I hired a crew, friends of my cousin, to start installing posts. Not little garden posts. 6x6 treated beams sunk 3 feet into the ground, capped with steel brackets. Karen came striding over the second she saw the first post go in. "What is this?" she demanded, voice sharp enough to slice a canoe paddle. "Property boundary fence," I said casually. "Perfectly legal. You can't just—" "Oh, I can," I said, holding up the stamp permit like it was a holy relic. "Got county approval yesterday. See the seal." Her mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "Fences have to be HOA approved," she snapped. "Wrong," I said, smiling for the first time in days. "Only if they're decorative. This is functional. Entirely exempt from your little style guide." Her face went the color of overripe tomatoes. By Monday, half the posts were in. By Wednesday, the first panels went up, tall, dark cedar with black metal caps, the kind that says privacy and don't mess with me in equal measure. Neighbors started whispering. Karen started sending emails. Brian even showed up, looking bewildered. What's with the fence?" he asked, staring up at the wall growing between him and his dock access. "Just marking what's mine," I said, hammering another bracket into place. When the last cedar plank slid into place with that satisfying clunk, I stood back, wiped the sweat off my forehead, and admired the towering testament to my spite. It wasn't just a fence, it was a line in the sand, or more accurately in the soil. A literal, physical reminder that I wasn't someone Karen could steamroll with HOA letterhead and fake smiles. The fence wrapped my entire shoreline like a protective arm. But the part that really twisted the knife was the segment boxing in the HOA's head office, that sad little converted bait shop where Karen held court. My 6-foot wall didn't block it off completely. That would have been illegal, and I wasn't giving her that kind of ammunition, but it hemmed it in so tightly that you could barely swing a car door open in the parking lot. HOA members had to shimmy sideways just to get past the gate. From the moment that section went up, the lake turned into an opera house, and Karen was the lead soprano. The first act came in the form of emails. At first, they were polite inquiries. "Dear property owner, we've noticed construction along the shoreline and near the HOA office. Can you confirm the purpose of this fence?" Then they turned passive-aggressive. "As you may know, HOA policy requires consultation for structures that impact community access. This is just a friendly reminder." By week 2, they were pure, shrill panic. "Your fence is interfering with official business. Remove it immediately or face legal consequences." Karen even CC'd the mayor on one email. I replied to every message the same way, with a scanned copy of my deed, a photo of my permit, and a single line. "All construction is on my property and fully compliant with county law. Have a lovely day." Then came Brian. He pulled up one afternoon, his black pickup kicking gravel across my driveway. He hopped out, ball cap turned backward like he was auditioning for a generic frat guy movie, and stared at the fence like it had personally insulted his masculinity. "You know you're being crazy, right?" he said. "No," I said, leaning on my hammer. "I'm being protective. Mom said you're making it impossible to use the dock." "Good," I said flatly. He opened his mouth to argue, but then he realized something. He didn't have an argument. Karen's little dock reassignment plan only worked if I played along. The fence didn't block my dock. It just made it clear whose dock it was. He muttered something about lawyers and being immature, then peeled out, tires spitting gravel like an overgrown teenager. By week 3, the HOA escalated to what I like to call the paper assault phase. Certified letters arrived daily, each thicker than the last. They were filled with legal jargon and threats that boiled down to the same thing: take it down. I read every single one carefully, and then I stacked them neatly in a box labeled Karen's Tantrum Archive. Because here's the thing about HOA lawyers: they rely on you being intimidated. But I wasn't just some random cabin owner. I had a file folder 3 inches thick with documentation, maps, permits, and that glorious sliver of deeded land wrapping the HOA office like a noose. Legally, I was untouchable. Meanwhile, the fence started having side effects. HOA meetings became a farce. Parking was such a nightmare that members started skipping them altogether. The bait shop office, once Karen's throne room, now felt like a prison yard. Every time she looked out the window, all she could see was my cedar panels staring back like an unblinking wall of defiance. And the gossip? Oh, the gossip spread like wildfire. The other cabin owners loved it. They'd stroll by just to see how the fence was coming, shaking their heads with these little smirks. One guy even brought popcorn to watch Karen's inevitable meltdowns. For years, she'd been the iron fist of the lake, writing up citations for chipped paint, dictating the color of people's mailboxes. Now she was the punchline of every lakeside bonfire story. But the true piece de resistance came when Karen tried her final weapon, the emergency board vote. One Saturday morning, she sent out an email blast. Emergency HOA meeting to discuss hostile property barriers obstructing community operations. Attendance mandatory. She must have thought she'd march into that meeting, gavel slamming, and declare my fence an unauthorized obstruction. What she didn't count on was me showing up with receipts. I rolled into that meeting armed like a one-person law office. Deed copies, county permits, historical maps, even a blown-up photo of Karen's son Brian taking selfies on MY Doc with the caption, "Unauthorized use." The room was packed. Karen tried to open with her usual pageant queen smile, but you could tell she was rattled. "This fence," she began, "represents a dangerous precedent. It interferes with community access, and—" I cut her off. "This fence," I said loudly enough for the back row to hear, "is on my property. Every inch of it. Here's the map. Here's the deed. And here's the permit the county stamped. If you don't like it, take it up with them." I slapped the documents on the folding table like I was slamming down an ace in poker. The room murmured. Karen flushed bright red. She tried to pivot, sputtering about spirit of community and cooperation, but the damage was done. The other members weren't blind. They saw the writing on the wall, literally. That meeting broke her. Not publicly. Not yet. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat, but her power cracked. The next week, the flood of threatening letters slowed. The HOA stopped inspecting my property every other day. Brian stopped showing up to sulk. And then came the sweetest email I've ever received. The HOA board has decided to rescind the shoreline reassignment plan for properties 15 to 20. We apologize for any confusion this may have caused. No signature. Not even Karen's trademark passive-aggressive regards. Just defeat. I celebrated that night on the porch, beer in hand, staring at the fence. The lake was calm, the moon glinting off the water, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt peace. The fence stayed. Oh yes, it stayed. It became a landmark, actually. People joked about the Great Wall of Karen. Tourists asked about it. Neighbors told the story over campfires. And every time Karen walked by it, which she had to because the HOA office was still boxed in, I could see her jaw tighten. She could have admitted she was wrong. She could have backed off months earlier. But she didn't. And now every plank of that fence reminded her of the one thing she couldn't control, me. In the end, I didn't just keep my dock. I kept the cabin. I kept my grandfather's legacy intact. And I taught Karen a lesson she'll never forget. When you push someone too far, they might just build a fence tall enough for the whole world to see your failure.